they'd put them over the side, a pilot would get in it, and off they'd fly. And in September of 1942, a Lieutenant Fujita dropped bombs in the Oregon forest in the hope of starting a forest fire. And then he went back to... Yeah, there is, right. And some of these, for their day, these submarines were huge. And then the Fujita landed next to the sub. He got out, they folded the wings, put it back on the track, into the cupola, closed the hatch, down we go. That's it. So yeah, but I mean, that's nothing like what happened to Britain, Germany, Japan. But virtually we emerged from this conflict unscathed. You know, we're going to have more food than we can eat, more clothes than we can wear, more gas than we can burn, and more money than we can spend. And we got the bomb. And if you're into this sort of stuff, what's not to like, right? The Soviet Union, on the other hand, gets what it wants, at least in the beginning here. Security. Keep in mind here, you know, this war, if you go to the Navy Department will tell you that 405,399 Americans got killed in World War II. And, you know, out of 16,112,000 that put on a uniform. That's according to the VA. And that was something like 12.2% of the American population out of 132 million people. And it's interesting because when you go to the Army, Department of the Army, since 9/11, you know, we went into Afghanistan between September 2001, October 2001, and to 2013, 2,850,000 Americans put on a uniform for Iraq and Afghanistan. It's only 0.8% of the American population. What happened here? And so it's fascinating here to see when you start tearing this apart. But America comes out of this smelling like a rose. I mean, we lose 1/3 of 1% of our population. That's it. That's all we lost. In a huge industrialized, corporatized, commercialized war. The granddaddy of wars in the Industrial Revolution. The Soviets, well, you know, they're going to get, Stalin's going to get what he wants, security. But it's going to cost them. You know, they got to Berlin and Prague. They're actually going to oversee Eastern and Central Europe, but it's going to cost them because they win the land war. The land war, for the most part, is fought here. You know, the decisive front. And out of 196.7 million people, they're going to lose 25 million of them. And one in every 7 Soviet is going to die in this war. You know, and so when you take a look at what Stalin, you know, sees here, go back to what I mentioned earlier, that Mr. Stalin thought that Versailles was a fraud, that there's going to be another war. That's why he industrializes this country. Not such an injudicious thing to do. Of course, it's going to take lives to industrialize the way he does it. Remember what I said. You know, we're going to accomplish in 25 years what took America 100. Well, he's going to use the whip for this. That's what he's going to do. He's going to use the whip. Well, we're talking Stalin, so that's, you know, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree with regards to other Russian leaders too. But here but when you break down, interesting, 25 million. Oxford did a study on this some years ago. Some sociologists and people expert in population, demographics, so on and so forth. And in 1940-41, in the Soviet Union, for every 10 women, there were 9.1 men. By 45 or 46, for every 10 women, there were 6.5 men. Ouch. And so, 75% of the casualties in the Soviet Union were men. And a lot of these men were what? Ages 20 to 45? Aren't these the men that rebuild the roads? Aren't these the men that rebuild the buildings in the towns? Aren't these the men that regenerate the population? That hurts. And so when you take a look at this country, this is a country that in 4 years, 70,000 villages, towns, hamlets that existed on June 21, 1941, no longer exist on May 7, 1945. They've been wiped off the map. Again, we don't know what that's like. They do. And so when Mr. Stalin, again, go back to what I mentioned earlier, at Yalta, when Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin are sitting down for the last time, Mr. Roosevelt's going to be dead not long after this. And Mr. Churchill is doing everything he can to get Stalin out of Poland, and Stalin's not going to leave. I mean, he's parked there. And he's not leaving. Good reason for this if you look at it from their perspective. I mean, they don't care what the rest of the world thinks. The Pope's not going to like this. Really, how many divisions does he have? They care less. He does see one thing here. He does see one thing. Germany invaded Russia 1914. The Poles invaded Russia in the 1920-21 Russo-Polish War. And then the big one, again, Hitler attacks the Soviet Union. And what was that causeway? Poland, Ukraine, into the Soviet Union. Well, we're not doing this anymore. We're staying. They don't trust the outside world. And this is indicative of what? Russian history. How many times has Russia been invaded? You recall, people here don't know what this is like. The Mongol depredations. It's a horror show here. And so he is not going to get out of Eastern Europe. And forget that stuff you see in that Patton movie. Well, we ought to arm these German troops to fight the Bolsheviks. Patton can say what he wants. He's out of his depth. The American public doesn't want to get involved in this kind of war in 1945. We've been through enough. We want out. He can go by himself if he wanted to, but that's about what the help he's going to get. It's interesting when you compare. The United States Army in World War II was only 89 divisions. That's it. Plus 6 Marine Corps divisions. That's it. Everything else was thrown into the Navy, the Army Air Force. That's it. Out of 16 million. Now there were about 8 million men in the Army, but only 89 divisions. Why? We didn't have to have a lot of divisions. The Soviets are doing a lot of the fighting. Plus you had the British Army, the Canadians, the Free French, so on and so forth. The Soviets didn't have that. 89 divisions altogether. We had 40 divisions in Europe, and we had like 21 divisions in the Pacific, plus the 6 Marine Corps divisions, and the rest were in reserve. The Soviets had upwards of 300 divisions alone in Eastern Europe when the war was over. You're going to tell them to get out? I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. They're there to stay. And I can tell you one thing, another man today understands that, and his name is Vladimir Putin. Mr. Stalin Light. He understands this. Again, transposing what's going on with Stalin in 45 to Mr. Putin now, Putin understands that what we call the Cold War, the focal point was Berlin. Now it's Ukraine, and they don't like it. It's historically Russia's backyard. And they don't like it that NATO is being expanded here. They don't like it. And so if you think they're going to allow Ukraine to become part of NATO, you better think again. Again, we're talking history here. But Mr. Stalin's fascinating. Another aspect of Stalin, when the war was over, Japan, right? Japan gets knocked out at the end because of the 2 atomic bombs. And, many major nations sent their scientists to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And, they investigate what went on. They write up their findings, collate their findings, hand them into their governments, and their governments go from there. Well, the Soviets did this. And Stalin's going to read some of these reports. And Stalin comes to the conclusion, get this, Stalin comes to the conclusion, like 1946-47, Stalin comes to the conclusion that if the Soviet Union gets into a war with the United States, the Soviet Union can take 4, 5, 6 of these bombs and still keep fighting. Well, he's not totally off his nut here. Compare the size of Japan to the Soviet Union. he sees the damage wrought at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he compares that to the damage wrought by 4 years of war with the Nazis in the Soviet Union. And they won that one. So, this is how this man thinks. And boy, you thought Osama bin Laden was dangerous? Of course, then again, let's look at the situation. This is 45, 46, 47. How are atomic weapons today? Let's understand the sign of the times here. Stalin, when the war is over, Georgy Zhukov, reputed to be the best of the Soviet generals. That's open to discussion, although I'm not diminishing his talents. But was the poster child expression of Soviet generalship. And that's interesting. In 45, maybe you've seen the newsreel footage of an officer or a rider on a white horse prancing before Red Square, and another rider, his adjutant, riding behind him. That was General Zhukov. Stalin was supposed to ride that horse, but had second thoughts because he's afraid if he fell off the horse, this might not look good to the Soviet people. And so Zhukov, having been a cavalryman, it makes sense, had him ride on a nice white horse, followed by his adjutant. Quite a scene. But then again, what happens after the war? He can't shoot Zhukov. Zhukov is popular. Hero, popular. Can't shoot him. Might not look so good. But he has him diminished. His pictures are taken out of books. Photos are being redoctored. His name is taken off some missives. In other words, it's a character assassination. I'm the one that led this, not Zhukov. Remember what happened at Kirov in 1934 when I went into that, the assassination, the murder of Sergei Kirov. Some people have laid that on Stalin's doorstep, but that was the jump to the purges. And so what happened to Zhukov? He will be demoted in stature. He will be sent to the Odessa military district. Now, most people here will go, what's that? That is a military district in the Soviet Union that's not considered very sensitive. And if you're sent here, Soviet officers knew what that meant. You've been demoted. In fact, if you want an equivalent, it is almost like being sent to Kansas and being at the same army base with Sergeant Ernie Bilko. You're out of the way here, even consigned to the motor pool with Doberman. I mean, this is what Stalin did to him. Of course, after Stalin dies, Mr. Zhukov is rehabilitated during the Khrushchev years, and he will write a book or two on the Great Patriotic War. An interesting character, Zhukov. He really is. But again, at least he survives. He wasn't shot or sent to the gulags. None of that happened. Of course, again, for Stalin, he can't do that because of the popularity. Another thing Stalin will do, he will, Andrei Zhdanov, who was the political commissar at Leningrad during the siege, Stalin's point man. Now, again, noting how Stalin thinks here, when Leningrad got cut off, and this is that's worth a talk too. I mean, that is one of the most stirring renditions of the human spirit in the entire 20th century. How a city of 3 million people could hold out for 872 days. They were virtually cut off from September 41 to January 43, but the Red Army really does not break the siege until January of 44. And upwards of 1 million people will die in this siege. I mean, some of these people are down to eating wallpaper pastes, skinned rats, and everything else. They put up with a lot. I mean, a lot. And imagine what that was like in the winter with no heat. And yet they will emerge. They will survive. Well, most will. But Andrei Zhdanov was the political commissar, ardent Stalinist, and at one point Georgy Zhukov, Stalin's fireman, was in control of the military aspects of the defense of Leningrad. But then again, he will be taken and then sent to Moscow as the Nazis are closing in here. Again, arrange the defense there. But Andrei Zhdanov is the one who comes to mind here, because in the spring of '42, when you had a lot of snow and ice, they couldn't find all the bodies of the people that starved to death or died in the bombings and the shellings. So guess what happens when the snow and the ice begins to melt? And Andrei Zhdanov will organize the population. And they will clean up the snow and the ice, clean up all the garbage, and all the bodies, thousands of them, are interred, and no outbreak of disease. None. But this is the organizing efforts of Andrei Zhdanov. Zhdanov will be given another job in 1946. The Great Patriotic War is over. And again, note how Stalin thinks here. The Great Patriotic War is over with. No longer is we're all Soviets. I'm opening up the churches again. We're all in this together. Let's throw out the fascist invader. Well, that's over with. That's done. Stalin trying to stay a step ahead here. So Andrei Zhdanov, what is he going to do? We need to make sure that the population is now resigned to the new reality here. The war is over with. I'm in control. And anybody who is not with the agenda is to be purged. Journalists, the writers, party hacks, academics, anyone who's not considered with the program in the post-war world is purged. What did Erdogan do in Turkey not all that long ago? Yeah. And so what I find fascinating here is he's now refashioning the Soviet Union, no longer for a world conflict, but to hold on to what the Soviet Union has. And you will see more or less the same sort of thing happen here in 1950. The McCarthy hearings? The McCarthy hearings were not for who lost China. We know who lost China. Chiang Kai-shek lost China. Lost it to Mao Zedong. No, what was it for? Purging communists and socialists. That's what this is for. That's what this is for. What happened to some of these playwrights and so on and so forth? Yeah, Dalton Trumbo come to mind here? Yeah, Ip Harbor, another one. The guy that wrote the lyrics for Somewhere Over the Rainbow? He was purged. Although Dalton Trumbo will come back when he was the screenwriter for Spartacus. And you know who made sure his name was on the screen credits? Kirk Douglas. Interesting where this goes. But you can see both countries now kind of running parallel here. The old European colonial powers no longer call the tune with the strategic, political, military, economic, and social dynamics of the globe. Two countries are going to do that now, the United States and the Soviet Union. And the United States is armed with something else besides military power, although we're cutting back here. We have something else the Russians don't have. And it's not the atomic bomb. It's a weapon, really, that can be used beyond the atomic bomb and probably more effective, known as the dollar. Known as the dollar. And we're going to use this currency. We're going to use this currency like a bludgeon. And Stalin knows this. He's no dumbbell. That's why he didn't want martial aid. He didn't want to be beholden to the dollar. And he understands the example of Britain. Here's a country, Britain, one of our allies. That's why this leads to this thing about, well, there are long-running friends. What are you kidding? Allies are not necessarily friends. Allies are somebody, an association, or another country you have something in common with, because there is some commonality here, maybe an objective or whatever the case may be. But does it last? Many times, no. What happened to the Grand Alliance between the Soviet Union, Britain, and America after Hitler put a bullet in his brain? Fell apart. And maybe that's what's happening here between the United States and Britain, to a certain extent. And Britain's going broke. 1940, this is a country with 16 billion, a creditor nation of $16 billion. 1945, it's a debtor of 12 billion. Has 12 million in gold left. They're virtually broke. We took in some $29 billion of the world's gold between 39 and 45. We have 77% of the world's gold. Wow. And so Britain, they need money to tide them over in 45. 3.7 billion. They come here. Can we have $3.7 billion? Yeah, you can have that money, but 930 million has to be spent here or no deal. Oh, and by the way, all your imports have to be paid for in gold or the dollar or no deal. And if you think you're going to go to one of your Commonwealth countries or all of them for a loan, forget it. You're not getting this money. No, Stalin's not stupid. He knows what this means. And also another man who understood this very well was a Lord Boothby from the British Parliament, who went before Parliament and called this an economic Munich. I think I feel the love in the room. So Stalin is not going to take Marshall Aid money by 48. Another man who comes into mind here, and I love bringing him up every so often because you have to, is George Kennan. There was this thing, since the war was over with, and there is no alliance anymore. Oh, Christmas. Now we're faced with another Hitler. His name is Joe Stalin. No, you're not. Kennan argued against this. No. Kennan was smart. He understood what Stalin wanted. Security. That's what they want, security. They're not getting out of Eastern Europe because they have been invaded so many times. They're staying. They're not in a position to launch world conquest. They're not. They can't do it. Even after the defeat of Nazi Germany, and keep in mind, Stalin, as of Yalta, 3 months after the defeat of Germany, they were supposed to get involved in the Far Eastern War. He did. He kept his word. Of course, again, it's easy to keep your word if you know you're going to get something out of it. But even then, between May 7, 1945, and August 9, 1945, when they invaded Manchuria, they'd already demobilized some upwards of 3 million men from the Red Army. They need them to go to work, to rebuild the country. And they're ready for global conquest? No. No. George Kennan understood this. This is why, when he was on the Soviet desk in Russia for the State Department, he virtually understood what's going to come down the road here. And he said, why go broke building this huge military? We have a superior economy. That's an advantage for us over the Soviets. We have a more palatable political alternative to the Soviet model. What's not to like about this? Use of our propaganda properly. Use of our intelligence services in a proper fashion. We don't have to go to war. Let's contain them and we'll outlast them and we'll wear them out. What happened in 1991? It fell apart. The Soviet Union did. He was virtually right. And he'll write an article that'll appear in Foreign Affairs in 1947. And he won't sign it. It'll be an article under the authorship of Mr. X. But of course, there were people in Washington who knew who wrote this article. But he's outlining his doctrine of containment. He will also be a co-author of the Marshall Plan. Stalin does not want Marshall Aid, again, because he doesn't want to be beholden to the dollar. So what's he going to... He says also, oh, by the way, the countries in the Eastern Bloc, they don't want this either. And yet again, one of the books on that list, now I find this absolutely, God bless you, intriguing. There's a book on that list. It's called Conversations with Stalin by Mia von Gies, Yugoslavia. And Gias is an interesting character. He was with Tito during the war in Yugoslavia. He was one of the partisans. And he will emerge from the war politically attached to Tito, but he will wind up in prison, in and out of prison during the 50s. And he will be a prolific writer on communism. But one book he wrote was called Conversations with Stalin. These are conversations that Tito had with Stalin and Gias was privy to. And one of them was in 1945 when Stalin tells Tito and Gias that the Germans are a very dynamic, intelligent, very organized people, and they will be back in 15 years. That's what he says. And he says it would behoove us Slavs to stick together. Us Slavs. And this smacks, I was doing this morning at the, I teach a course on World War I over the Latham Center in New Canaan. This goes into what I was talking about this morning in the lead up to 1914. This Germanic idea, beware of the pan-Slav flood, which was prevalent in the 19th century. Beware of the pan-Slav flood. Then it gets to be a toss-up of who some of these Germanics are going to hate more, Jewish people or Slavs. And so, what does Stalin say? It behooves all of us Slavs to stick together. Yeah, as long as he runs it. That's what he's getting to. And so it's interesting how Stalin looks at these developments when the war is over. And you're seeing at this point too, where the United States, with NSA 47, redoing the military establishment here for the Cold War, more along corporate lines. That's what you're seeing, the corporatization of military hierarchy. George Marshall started this in 1939, 1940, when he consulted the corporate structures of GM, GE, Ford, so on and so forth, and then restructured the command staff along these lines. It's fascinating. You can find this in the from Root to McNamara. It was an Army study done, and it's a history of this. Fascinating read. The growth of the command structure in the United States Army. That's a fascinating read. It really is. And so you see this happening. Well, what do you think the Russians are doing? Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union. He corporatized the Soviet Union. Use of state capitalism in the 1930s. In other words, Russia will not be a great power unless it industrializes. And so you see virtually what's developing here. What you have now, corporate states. That's coming. That's coming. Korea. Interesting here, this idea after the war, and Stalin's a beneficiary of this. Well, the Soviet Union is a beneficiary of this to a certain extent. This idea that comes out of 1945, really beginning in 1918, this revolutionary nationalism. And again, the United States and the Soviet Union are products of this decline of European colonialism. Again, the Europeans are not able to call the tune anymore in global affairs. The United States and Soviet Union will. But out of the collapse of the French, especially the French and the British colonial empires, this revolutionary nationalism. You can go back to Sun Yat-sen, 1911, 1912 in China. Mao Zedong in the 20s. Ho Chi Minh. Remember, he went to Versailles, 1919. No, I forget it. You're believing in Wilson's 14 points. No, forget it. Your country's going to remain part of the French colonial system. So he joins he helped form the French Communist Party. Ho Chi Minh did. Interesting. Then he'll go to Russia. Then he's going to go to China, then back to Vietnam, and then back into China again. And so you see what's coming down the pipe by 1945. And so what's Stalin going to do? He's going to cater to these so-called brushfire revolutions, this revolutionary nationalism. And it's not hard for Stalin to do this. You know, this nationalization of communism. The Vietnamese weren't interested in taking over the whole Southwest Pacific. They didn't care. They want to unite Vietnam. That's revolutionary nationalism. You know, Ho always said, I'm a communist before I'm a nationalist. Well, Stalin caters to this. This is one way to maybe undermine the West. And we're going to be against this. Especially after people like Archimedes El-Patti from the OSS, who was parachuted into North Vietnam to help Ho, is telling Washington we can work with this guy. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only one. And so Stalin understands this and will act accordingly. He's going to support North Korea, obviously against South Korea, seeing South Korea as a U.S. satrap. And that's really one of the tragedies of the war. I meant in the 1945. I mean, you can understand why Italy, Germany, and Japan will be occupied. Well, they started the war, they lost. But Korea, did Korea help start the war? No. It gets caught up in what? Post-Cold War politics, the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Interesting about Korea, they got taken by the Japanese in the 1945 war. Japan will annex this place in 1910, hold on to it until 1945, and these people still can't have a unified country after 1945. And it's going to lead to a war in 1950. But the Soviet Union at the same time is raising its stature on the world scene, except for one thing here. Sure, they're going to blow an A-bomb in 1949 and join the group of atomic powers, one of two that exist. But at the same time here, you can see the seeds under Stalin's era, the end of Stalin's era, where you're beginning to see going to see a split in the communist world. The rise of Red China. Mao Zedong. 1949. And you know, up to this point, Mao is the junior partner. Although he has a dogma on communism, revolution by the peasant, which is going to resonate in Asia. The Vietnamese are going to grasp this. Ho and Vo Nguyen Giap are going to grasp this. In fact, even on Cuba, isn't Castro going to give some of this land back to the peasants? What he's going to do. And so you see this potential split here. Interesting, after Mao took power in Russia, he goes to Moscow. Big state visit. The two giants in the communist world. And yet, even at this huge function, a little Russian girl comes out with all these flowers. Now you would think Mr. Mao Zedong, as the distinguished visitor, guess who the girl should have gone to with the flowers? No. She goes to Stalin, the father of the Soviet people. Well, what's Mao Zedong? Chopped liver? No, it's an orchestrated event here to show who is the leader of the so-called communist world. Stalin. I mean, if I was Mao, I would have been insulted by that. What? You know, why bother? Yet after Stalin's dead, you know, after the Korean War, and with as America gets involved in Southeast Asia, you are seeing this split between Moscow and China as China grows as a power. Stalin himself, is going to die in March of 1953. March 5, 1953. And then there'll be the struggle for power. Nikolai Bulganin, Lavrentiy Beria, the NKVD chief, who, by the way, is going to get a little too big for his britches, and he'll have to be terminated. Like some of his successors, Genrik Yagoda, Nikolai Yezhov. These guys who perpetrated the Stalin's purge. And these guys waded in blood. And then Khrushchev is going to be the ultimate victor here. He'll take over the Soviet Union. But the fact of the matter is that this idea of a Stalin, interesting, Stalin was considered general secretary of the party. Khrushchev, when he finally took power, was considered first secretary. What does that terminology mean? Well, keep in mind, Stalin, general secretary, what connotation does that lead to? Overall control, perhaps? You know, at one point, Molotov is president of the government. Well, what does that mean? He's just the caretaker for Stalin. But first secretary has a different meaning than general secretary, so it seems like the Russians aren't making that mistake again. Although, keep in mind, there was a poll taken in Russia in 2013 in which 29% of the people polled thought the country needed another Stalin. Apparently, law, remember that? Law and order is more important than rights. And yet, in 2014, another poll was taken, and 46% of the Russian people agreed that with Mr. Putin that we need a 1 million-man army, we need more ships in the Navy, more aircraft in the Air Force. You know, it's hard once you've had this taste of empire to get rid of it. I can imagine the wailing and the gnashing of teeth of some people of British heritage in 1945, 46, 47, 48. Even the French. It's hard to get rid of that taste for empire. Hard to get rid of that taste. And so when you take a look at what Stalin constructed, and then take a look at what Mr. Putin maybe is attempting to do here, although I kind of liken Mr. Putin to Napoleon III of the 19th century. You know, Napoleon III was trying to resurrect France as a great power here after the debacle of Napoleon I by the Congress of Vienna, 1815. Well, what do you think Mr. Putin might be trying to do here after the post-collapse of the Soviet Union? Trying to keep or resurrect Russia as a great power in the world? Keep in mind, he was successful, at least so far, in Syria. He was able to keep his client on the seat, Assad. And so do some people over in that area appreciate that? Yeah, it looks like somebody who knows what he's doing, unlike we do. We go to Iraq, and after 8 years, we're out of there. And so it's interesting what you're seeing in the after effects of Stalin. And another aspect of this I find fascinating. I'm reading a book now by a Nicholas Budashev on the Russian Revolution, but he has a real cerebral approach to this, going into communism as a failure to a certain extent, like capitalism is the recipient of a failure of Christianity. There's a lot of that one. Yeah, is right. And the idea here is, his idea here is capitalism has eviscerated Christianity. And so has communism. With this earthly promise of, what's capitalism really? An interaction between one or two people, or maybe a group of people for economic gain, right? Well, what happened to this socialist idea, idea of Christianity, everyone helping each other out? That's what he's getting to. Communism, he says, is the same thing, where you have this idolatry of the working man. And you purge society of all these threats, especially the bourgeoisie, and then you have a social society, not only economic, but a society built on the working man. Not that that's really going to work. But then he says, at the same time here, interesting, that the idea of Marxism is Western European. Well, Karl Marx was what? He came out of the German states, right? Western European, as opposed to Bolshevism, which comes out of where? Russia. They have Russified this idea. It's not a revolution based on just the factory worker. Because as Lenin understood, getting back to the Russian Revolution, following on with Stalin, Lenin understood that the peasant was 90% of the Russian population. So for the Russian Revolution to succeed, or the Bolsheviks to succeed, the workers have to be amalgamated with the peasant. And that's basically what he's going to try to do. And they're going to succeed. So they've Russified this Western idea. But then again, as Berdyshev, offers here, that it had to be some sort of religious experience, because now people are involved in a secular agenda at the expense of religion. People have to gravitate to something. And so even a secular idea can have religious overtones to it. It's fascinating how he's trying to put this together. And then Mr. Stalin. Stalin here. Stalin, Lenin was not a god. He was made into a god after he died. Of course, who helps to do that? Joe Stalin. Again, think how Stalin is trying to take power here. He was one closest to Lenin when Lenin was dying after being shot and after the strokes, 1924. Stalin helped to plan the funeral. Stalin was one of the pallbearers. Stalin, when Lenin in 1922-23 wanted poison to end it all after the stroke, or after one of his strokes, Stalin wouldn't give him the poison. The longer Lenin stays alive, the more I can be attached to Lenin at the expense of Trotsky. And so this cult of Lenin comes up. Even with the mausoleum. Remember the body being in the mausoleum. A lot of this is Stalin. He ties his end to Stalin. In other words, creating Stalin and Lenin as what? A god? A deity? Is this the Marxist Leninist deity? Lenin? Forget Marx, it's Lenin. And yet I am attached to Lenin. And so you see this idea of the cult of the personality take over, and this is Stalin. And this cult of the personality leads to what? What is he going to do after 1927-28? Sure, he's going to collectivize the peasant. He's going to forcibly industrialize the Soviet Union, but Sergei Kirov will be murdered, and then there's a purge of the party. And so after he gets rid of people like Grigory Zinoviev, Nikolai Bukharin, Mikhail Tomsky, people like this who came up at the time of Lenin, early Bolshevik, early adherents to Bolshevism, they're going to be purged. And he's going to bring along people like Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, Kaganovich, people like this who owe their hides to who? Stalin. The cult of the personality. What does Hitler do? And with many of these leaders, it's what? I. That sound familiar? And so this idea of a communist revolution, we ought to call that into question. Is it really communism? Or was Stalin just another dictator? And you can get into conversations with some of these, and I've done this, it's interesting to listen to them talk, when you get into people here who are really into socialism or have a Marxist taint to them, how, oh no, Stalin wasn't what Marxism was really about. But again, maybe in the end, it's irrelevant. Stalin came, took power, and now he's gone. Gone for a long time. But the impact of Stalinism, Russia won't get rid of that, if they ever do, for years. Even with Nazi Germany, Hitler, remember the 1,000-year Reich? Remember that one? And so again, this cult of the personality. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. And even the German army in 1934, taking the pledge. I swear to give my unconditional oath to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the Third Reich. Well, what happened to the oath to the country? And you see this develop here. It's frightening to see. It truly is. How a leader can grab the allegiance of millions. Millions. What happened to critical thinking? What is it someone said not all that long ago? Only I know the problems and only I know how to solve them. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. History does what? Yeah. So it's interesting when, again, it's not any different here. You see with the beginning here with the Communist Manifesto, this idea of liberating the worker. But like anything else man does, as it becomes more popular, as you get more adherents, aren't there more opinions? Aren't there more ideas? Aren't there more wants and desires? So what happens to the original intent? Gets diluted, watered down? What happened with the Islamic religion? You know, after Muhammad died, it changed. What happened to Christianity over the years? It changed. They all change. All these movements change. Sometimes for the good, sometimes not for such good things. We know that. And this is an essence of Stalin. And yet at the same time, after all the millions of deaths and after the, no freedom of expression whatsoever, there are people who still want somebody like a Stalin. Going back to that. In fact, yeah, the good way to end this is, again, some people heard me say this before, but for those that didn't, I know two fellows who've been doing business in Russia for years, when it was still the Soviet Union. And they were in the Moscow airport back in 2011. They're getting ready to come home. Well, you've been in these airports. You go into one of the little stores at the airport, you get your candy or cigarettes, whatever the case may be. And these two fellows bought some Russian chocolates. They're individually wrapped. And they brought them home for the kids, right? So they thought they'd pop a couple of them. And, well, you got the cheap cellophane. You undo the cellophane. You got the cheap tin foil the chocolates are wrapped in. And, they pick up the chocolate off the tin foil. There's a picture of Stalin on the tin foil. This is 2011. Wow. They were shocked. They said, Mark, you realize this? I said, yeah, hey, there are still those who would like to see a Stalin-like character. Maybe they've got him now. Maybe they've got him now. And so you see these ideas of authoritarianism with some people, even among the mass of some of the public. Yeah, that's a good idea. People have too much freedom or whatever the case may be. That's what Stalin represents. Besides representing somebody who's wedded to power. And I will not take any threats to my hold on power. The purges are a case in point here. Anybody have any questions? Yes. The question is, the book Red Notice, and about Putin being the richest man in the world at $200 billion. It's kind of hard to say for certain, where Mr. Putin has his money or whatever. I mean, it could very well be true. And yet some people will say he's still beholden to the oligarchs. I don't. Did he make a deal with those oligarchs to take control of Russia? Yes, he did. But at the same time here, you can tell some of the power he has that, some of these corporations in Russia, their boards of directors, well, Mr. Putin made sure that representatives of the intelligence service and the military are on corporate boards. Trust his buddies, doesn't he? Interesting. So, of course, there again, follow the money. So, yes. Right. Well, Stalin really wasn't going to have him shot. He can't. He's too popular. Right? Even when Zhukov's pictures, are expunged from books and magazines and so on and so forth, he still can't have him shot. He's too popular. And plus, at the same time here, this is the Soviet Union of the post-war world, not the pre-war world, and it might not look so good if he's. I know he was going to start another purge in the 50s. That's what's said about purge against the doctors' purges against Jewish people. But again, post-war, since Russia is taking its place on the world stage as a power broker, might not look so good if he's going to have purges like he had in the 1930s. Yeah, but still at the same time, he does. Stalin's too clever for that, too smart for that. Well, I mean, keep in mind here too. One of the reasons you're going to have a Russian Revolution in the first place, or the Revolution 1945, is that Russia as an entity, Tsarist Russia, wasn't working out. Benefits were going to a restricted clique of people, the royal family and the landed gentry for the most part. Russia really wasn't all that industrialized yet, but it's industrializing at this point. And what do the people get? The lash. Many don't own the land. Or with the abolition of serfdom, they can buy the land, but they got a 50-year mortgage and they're stuck in indentured servitude. Do they really own the land they're digging in? No, they don't. So there's going to be a backlash here. So what happened to this cohesiveness of a Tsarist Russia? And so you see here, and so what is the Tsar going to do? He's going to get involved in a war against Japan. Well, we're all part of the Tsarist Russian Empire. Let's drop our differences and get together. Well, what happened when that war didn't work well? That doesn't mask the problems they have at home. And so again, when you take a look at the Soviet Union, what happened to this so-called socialist proletarian state? Correct. And so the justification for existence, are the people really getting anything out of it? Well, keep in mind, when Putin first became president in 2000, actually when Yeltsin retired, Mr. Putin became the interim president until the elections of May, June 2000. Russia had nowhere to go but up, and so his first 4 years in office, the economy went up 7% a year. Well, that shows something, and it's going to go up. It's going to go up when he's his second term, 2005 to 2008. Purchasing power went up 72%. People like that. People like that. And then Medvedev will take over. Of course, Mr. Putin is the president. He's no longer prime minister anymore. But he will become the prime minister after that, or president. And then Medvedev will be out of office, and Putin's been the top dog ever since. But at the same time, he divided up the economy among the oligarchs. That's one of the reasons he stays in power. I mean, it's a corporate state. But at the same time here, is Russia's economy doing as well as it did in its first 8 years? No. Of course, part of that is, what happened to fossil fuels, the price of the fossil fuels? And is that a lot of Russia's economy? Maybe that's why they're trying to make a deal with the Saudis as of last October. So Mr. Putin does have problems in resurrecting that economy to keep the people on board. But then again, he looks like a hero with what he did in Syria. Here we go. Here we go. Now we're going back to Mr. Mussolini. When you read the doctrine of Mussolini's fascist Italy, it's a corporate state. Boy, now this gets interesting now. But no, not at all. But what did Stalin do? Didn't he industrialize the Soviet Union? His idea going into a corporate state, what's China? What are they doing? Are they really communists? There's a discussion now for you. And so you saw Mr. Stalin here understand. Again, go back to Versailles, the biggest fraud ever perpetrated on modern man, and then go back to 1914 when the Tsar mobilizes 6 million men, 4 million have rifles. And Stalin, how's that going to work? And so I have to industrialize because I know there's another war coming. And I'm not going to do that with a proletarian revolution. How's that going to work? And so Stalin will industrialize the country by focusing on heavy industry. But at the same time, there were some of these Bolsheviks. Well, this isn't quite what Lenin... We want to urbanize. We want to industrialize. But this isn't the way, Lenin wanted to do it. Regardless, Lenin's dead. I'm in control here. And so at this point, and he's going to say, well, for socialism to really take root in this country, to really take root, we have to industrialize, create a supervisory class, a class of bourgeoisie. Then and only then can we have a communist revolution where we take out the ruling class and we're all workers. Really? That's masking an industrialization of the country for him to stay in power. There's really no intention here of communism, yet what is he going to do? Well, we're building a socialist state. We're building this proletarian revolution. We're continuing the proletarian revolution. No, you're not. It's a totalitarian. Pay lip service to it. We're going to Iraq to bring democracy. And so the idea is to stay in power. And so it does get down to the point here for the people, how are you going to take power? You think it's going to work in the voting booth? No. You don't control the streets. You don't control the voting booth. History tells you that. Worked here in 1776. Yes. On the face of this handout, the bibliography, I did have a quote here, and it goes into this conversation we've been having here. The revolutionaries of today are the reactionaries tomorrow. Try disproving that. But of course, the last quote I had on this, yeah, you heard me say this before, Stalin's reply when questioned about the validity of the penal battalions, 178,000 men he had in those penal battalions. It takes a brave man to be a coward in the Red Army. I thought that was a quote that really sums up Stalin pretty well. But again, that goes back to what we were saying here. The revolutionaries today are the reactionaries tomorrow. And that's true. That's true. Stalin is one of them. We'll be back here in March. But that'll be called Politics of the Dollar. Thank you. Thank you very much.